So today's lesson, we are going to talk about the 5 constitutional compromises. In the last lesson, we talked about how our founding fathers agreed that they're going to meet and that they were going to amend the Articles of Confederation. Well, they quickly realized that that was not going to be a good idea. So let's toss that out and let's create a new document. So, they first were going to address how should each state be represented in Congress. And they have 2 different sides. So, on the left side of your paper, let's write in the first side, and on the right side, we will put the opposite side. So, here is side 1, here is side 2, and then in the middle, we're going to put their compromise, their agreement that they ended up coming up to. So, the first side is James Madison's Virginia plan. Now, James Madison gets credit for this because he's from Virginia and he wrote this. And he said, let's have 3 branches of government. Now, he got that idea from Montesquieu. And he said that the legislative branch should be based on population. Now, the states who had a large population, like Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New York, all really, really liked that plan because they had a large number of people who lived there, and that means that they would have more representation in the legislative branch. So that seemed pretty awesome. However, the smaller states that did not have a lot of people who lived there were like, this isn't going to work because they would not have any power in Congress compared to the rest of them. So, after talking about it some more, this guy named William Patterson ends up coming up with the New Jersey Plan. Now, why is the New Jersey Plan called the New Jersey Plan? Because William Patterson is from New Jersey. He also agreed with having 3 branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial, just like the Virginia Plan. But he said, let's have a unicameral legislature. So if you will, make sure you underline the word unicameral and write what it means. It means one house legislator, that they would just have one house in the legislature and that every single state would have exactly 2 representatives per state. So that means that New York, which has always had a lot of people who live there, and Delaware, which doesn't really have that many people, would each be considered equal. So you have these 2 plans. This one stresses equality, and the Virginia plan stresses population. And so they argued about this plan for 6 weeks. For 6 weeks, they went back and forth and they argued about this before finally deciding something called the Great Compromise. Now, this is also known as the Connecticut Plan because the guy who came up with it, Roger Sherman, is from Connecticut. And so he suggested, let's have a bicameral legislature. So one house would be based on population, just like the Virginia plan suggested, and that would be called the House of Representatives. The other house would be based on equal representation, just like the New Jersey plan, and that would be called the Senate. So if we look at this, what this map says is how many people that live in each state make up how many representatives you're going to have in the House of Representatives. So every single state, if I come back up here, every single state is going to be equal in the Senate. So every state gets 2 senators. However, how are we going to know the population? They're going to use the census. So they started in 1790 with the census, and every 10 years they count the U.S. population. So it started in 1790, so then your very next one would be 1800, and then so forth until the very last one that we had was in 2010. The very next one will be in 2020. And so what this says is that smaller states that do not have a lot of people, like North Dakota, they have 1 representative, and that 1 representative represents the entire state. But larger states that have way more people, like California has 53 House of Representative members because there's so many people that live there. Now, this is just counting up the House of Representatives. This is not including the Senate because the Senate is based on equality. So if we look and we consider that we have the House of Representatives in California, which is 53, and then you have the Senate, which is 2. So 53 plus 2 equals 55 total people in the U.S. Congress that represent California. If we come back over here to North Carolina currently has 13 House of Representatives, and then we have 2 senators. So how many representatives does North Carolina have? Total 13 plus 2. In each state, we've got to do that. Now, some states still don't have a whole lot of power. Like Montana has 1 House of Representatives member, and then they have 2 senators. So 3 people in Congress is not a lot of representation. However, then not a lot of people live there either. So they tried to make this as fair as possible so that everybody was happy. Now, the second issue, while we're counting up population, is should slaves count as part of the population? And you had 2 different sides. So again, we're going to write one side on the left side 1 on the left side, and side 2 on the right side, and then we're going to put the compromise in the middle. So southern states said, let's count the slaves as population. Typically, southern states did not have a lot of people. They did not have high population rates because it's incredibly hot in the south. And whenever it's that hot, and it wasn't until we got air conditioning that people started moving to the Bible Belt, which is the South. So southern states said we want to count the slaves because they wanted to increase their power in the House of Representatives. And the North said, no way. They do not want to count them as population. They said that slaves were considered property, and so if you own slaves, you should have to pay taxes on them. Well, the South was like, oh, nobody, and they said, we will walk away if you make us pay extra taxes. We're not going to have that mess. So they argued back and forth about this, and so they finally ended up coming up with a compromise. Now, this is one of the things we have to consider, that in 1789, all of these red states are slave states. And so you can clearly see that there is a majority of slave states. And so when the slave states threw a fit and said, you're not going to do this, that was a big deal. And so they weren't able to pass just a compromise that was going to make the North and the South happy. So here's your Northwest Ordinance Territory, which they said there's no slaves that can live out there. And none of this out here belonged to America yet. But mostly you had your free states up here, and then of course Pennsylvania, which has always been the city, or they have the Philadelphia, which is the city of brotherly love. Something else to consider is where do the majority of slaves live? And so if we look at it, North Carolina does not have a high slave population, or never had one. And it's largely because we don't have a great deal of ports. We have Wilmington down here, but other than that, we have the graveyard of the Atlantic. So when ships would come to America, they couldn't get in through the Outer Banks. So they would end up going through Charleston or Savannah, not Richmond, excuse me, I'm sorry. That you end up having a lot of ports up here, and so they could come right up here. And so that means wherever you had ships being able to come, that means you could grow a lot of crops. So a lot of the slave population is going to be based around these port cities, or places where it's very easy to handle the soil, and it's not crazy hot. So the compromise that we end up having is called the 3/5 compromise. And here's a fraction in history. And it says that if out of 5 slaves, 3 would count towards representation in Congress and as taxable property. So if you own 15 slaves, 3 of those would count for population and for taxable property. And so neither the South nor the North were entirely happy about this. However, it worked out. The next issue that they had to decide while we're talking about slaves is they're like, hey, well, what about bringing slaves to and from the country? So should the federal government regulate foreign and interstate commerce? Now, whenever we talk about commerce, you need to make a note that commerce means to trade, and trade means that we're bartering. So say you want a pencil, or you want a pencil, I have a pencil. However, say I want a piece of gum. We could barter, and I'll give you a pencil for a piece of gum. So the northern states said that Congress should be able to regulate foreign commerce, so that's us trading with China or Japan or England, and Congress should be able to regulate trade in between states. versus the southern states said absolutely not. They were very worried that the federal government was going to tax all the products that they were making because the South made a lot of stuff. When you're making cotton and indigo and corn and tobacco, they're making all of these things, and they were worried that if they taxed these products, then it was going to hurt the economy. They also said that if the federal government regulated the slave trade between Africa and the Americas, then that means that the slave trade would go away, and they said that the slave trade was vital to the Southern economy, that the slave owners could not possibly produce all the tobacco and cotton and indigo if they did not have free labor. So, when we look at this, it's important for us to know that when we're looking at Africa, now notice how long this map is extending its time, that we're looking at slavery going to not only, if we follow this, not only are the slaves coming to America, but they're also having to go to the West Indies, they're going to New Orleans, they're going to Mexico, and a great deal of slaves are going to South America. And if we count up these numbers, you had 4.5 million that came to the Caribbean versus 500,000 that came to America. And then you had 5 million that went to South America. Regardless, this is still a lot of people that were being shipped from one continent to another continent or hemisphere. And they had to become well versed in having to produce all of these things. So, the compromise we end up coming up with is called the Slave Trade and Commerce Compromise. And what they decide is that Congress could regulate interstate and foreign commerce. However, they could not tax things that are leaving the country, which are called exports, and they could not mess with the slave trade before 1808, which was 20 years after this date. So what this pretty much means is that they could not come up with an answer, and so they said, let's just leave it alone right now and let the next group of leaders take care of this. The fourth issue is that how should we pick our leader? Should they be called a president? Benjamin Franklin was advocating for a king, by the way. But everybody else is saying no. And so we're going to put side one over here on the left side, and we have states who said that they thought that the regular people were not capable of being knowledgeable to know about what was going on. They felt like citizens should elect their representatives from their area, and then these people should then pick the president. There's a problem with that, though, because what happens if these people are friends and they just pick their friends? Which could actually happen and kind of did. Or there's your group of people who feel like we want to have a direct voice in this. I was going to say vote. And so should the people just directly pick the president? Well, hopefully you know which way we elect the president, and it's not either one of these. Congress does not pick the president, and nor do we just directly vote for the president. That's not how it works. So the compromise is called the Electoral College. Now, you cannot go to this college, and so this is just a name that they picked. This is not one that you can apply to. But what they decided is that when we vote in the election, we are going to tally up our votes, and whoever wins the majority in their state are going to give their electoral votes to the person who wins the election. So our electoral votes, how do we know what that is? That's going to be directly related to the number of people that we have in Congress. So do you remember this map we were looking at earlier? It was a little more colorful earlier. However, we did talk about how there are 13 representatives for the House for North Carolina, and there are 2 senators, leaving us with a grand total of 15. So in the state of North Carolina in 2008, 51% of North Carolinians picked Barack Obama to be the president. And so what that means is that these 15 electors cast their ballot. So these are 15 people, this is their job. They went to Raleigh and they cast their ballot for Barack Obama, even though it was only 51%. Now in 2012, apparently North Carolina was dissuaded with that, and we cast 51% of the voters in North Carolina in 2012 voted for Mitt Romney. So that means 15 electors all had to go to Raleigh and they all have to vote for Mitt Romney. They have to do what the people of North Carolina say. This is called an all or nothing system. California also has the same thing, as well as Texas, Florida. There's only 2 states that do not have an all or nothing system. So, this is what I just explained, that if Obama wins the majority of North Carolina's votes, just like he won in the 51%, then all 15 of North Carolina's electoral votes go to Obama. Now, you have to get exactly half plus one more of all of these numbers up here. All of these numbers equal out until 538. Now, if you take 538 and divide it in 2, that would be 269. But you can't win 269 to 269, so you got to have one more, which is why you have to have 270 electoral votes in order to win the election. So here's an electoral map in 2012, and what we have is all the red states. These are the ones that voted for Mitt Romney, and all the blue states are the ones that voted for Barack Obama. Now, if you look at this, it looks like there's way more red, but it went in a lot less blue. However, the blue states that were won versus the red states, we have to look at those numbers. So Barack Obama won 55, 12, 7, 6, 9, 5, and then we get over here, and he won a lot of the northeast. 20, 29, 13, 18, 16, 10, 10, 6, 20. I mean, those are really big numbers. Not to mention all of these the New England ones. So he had 303 electoral votes to Romney's 235, because Romney won the 3, 3, 3, 5, 6, the smaller states. Does that make sense? If you need more explanation on this, feel free to let me know, and I'll be glad to explain that. The 5th issue was that they had to decide who should get more power, the states or the federal government. So side 1 would be called Federalists, and these are people who supported the new Constitution. They believed that the new Constitution that they had just created should be supreme, that the federal government should be supreme, and that the states really needed a direction. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay all contributed together, and they wrote the 85 papers called the Federalist documents, the Federalist Papers. And when they wrote these, they were advocating for to ratify, which means to approve the new Constitution. Now, on the opposite side of that, you have the Anti-Federalists, and so they are opposed to ratifying, which means to approve, the new Constitution. They believe that people's rights would be taken away unless the rights were written down. And these were supporters. They thought that the new government would support wealthy people over regular people. So Thomas Jefferson, Samuel Adams, and Patrick Henry. Now, hopefully you remember Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry as people who were in the Sons of Liberty. And so they were rebel rousers then, and they're still opposed to not having someone tell them what to do. Here is a flag that we typically do see today. Now, this did not start at this time. However, the whole "don't tread on me," tread means to walk, and so don't walk on me. If we go back, Benjamin Franklin had drawn that snake earlier that we looked at, and it was cut up into different pieces. We also have a rattlesnake here. Don't walk on the rattlesnake, because what will happen if you walk on the rattlesnake should be pretty obvious. So their compromise is going to be at the Bill of Rights, that the Federalists say, fine, we will add the Bill of Rights, which are going to be our first 10 amendments, as long as the Anti-Federalists would agree to ratify, which means to approve. And they did. They ratified in 1789. Now, there were 2 states that held out who did not ratify immediately. North Carolina was number 12 because, sometimes us North Carolinians can be a little bit stubborn. And the 13th state to ratify would be that tricky old Rhode Island who didn't show up for anything. And now you need to work on your Federalist documents.